Louhs. It's such a pleasure to have all of you with us on this Tuesday, November 5th. It's election day. I know that many people will hopefully practice their and exercise their constitutional rights to vote. But we're so grateful that you're joining us on this evening. If you're new to Live with the Louhs, we wanted to remind you that this is a show that merges both faith and psychology together. Roxanne is a clinical psychologist, and I'm a parish priest in Jacksonville, Florida. And our hope and our prayer was that we would provide a show every single week that would inspire, encourage you, but also to give you practical ways to apply your faith in your everyday life, not only for you, but also for your family and the world that we're living in as well. So thanks again for being with us. And as always, we encourage you to stay connected to us all throughout the week on our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, we're on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, all under the headings of The Louhs, and that last name is spelled Louhs, so it's The Louhs. And also we're on YouTube. In fact, all of our sermons are archived on our YouTube channel. And so if you love our show, I definitely would encourage you to check out our YouTube channel. In fact, you can subscribe to it and have access to all of our sermons and all the video messages that we've sent over the years. And hopefully you'll find those inspirational as well. And several years ago, we started sending out our daily messages. And this is just another way that we try to connect with all of you. And so we encourage you, if you haven't subscribed to those messages, go to our website at thelouhs.com/subscribe. And that way you can get the daily message. You can subscribe for it and get the daily inspirational message in your email inbox every single week, every single day at 7 a.m. Eastern time. And as always, friends, we love to hear from you. You know, we know that for many of us, sometimes we can listen to a podcast and we kind of sometimes just simply listen to it. But we really want to encourage you, especially on this show tonight. If you're a parent or if you're an adolescent, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to get your input, but also answer some of the questions that you may have. So you can do so by calling us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. And if you're also tuning in and watching us on the Louhs YouTube channel, the Louhs Facebook channel, please feel free to leave a comment there. I'll be checking that throughout the show. And Ancient Faith's YouTube page is also broadcasting the show live, and you can leave a comment there, and our producer, Matushka Trudy, will make sure that she gets to that. And I know that many of you are getting ready for the holiday season. I can't believe, Roxanne, we're already talking about the holidays. We're in November now.
I can't believe it's November.
It is, and just remind you, if you're looking for a gift, we do have two books that we published here through Ancient Faith. One called Renewing You, a Priest, a Psychologist, and a Plan, that really just highlights 8 of the biggest topics that we see as a priest and psychologist. And again, very practical ways to apply your faith in your everyday life. And then our most recent book called 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, How Christ's Light Transcends Our Darkness, really chronicles the 7 statements that Jesus makes on the cross over a 6-hour period. These are what's recorded in the Bible. And it's there to help us when we face the difficult and dark days of our life. It's not a matter of really if we're going to face a day like that. It's just when. And oftentimes we're not prepared for that. So we want to give you those practical ways. And again, these make great Christmas gifts. And all the proceeds go to outreach ministries in our community and towards the American Cancer Society in honor of our fathers. So let's get started. You know, friends, I don't know about all of you, but Roxanne and I are blessed to have 2 extraordinary children, George and Gabriella. And George is a 17-year-old graduating high school this year, and Gabriella is a 10th grader. And it's such a blessing to have them. But I will tell you, as a parent now, I struggle to think how my parents did it so many years ago when I was in high school and as an adolescent. I mean, what we're seeing right now is that in almost every study that we researched in preparing for tonight's show is that our youth are under tremendous amounts of pressure. In fact, unrealistic and unrealized pressure in ways that have reflected that probably in no other time in our history have we seen so much pressure being placed on them. We see pressure from today's culture, what they're asking them to adapt and to adjust to. We see pressure oftentimes to see comparing themselves to other people and other youth. We also see pressure, though, from what the expectations are upon them. Perhaps one of the biggest pressures that we're seeing is this a desire for them to be overachievers. And what we want to be very clear is that we're all about setting goals and standards for our children to accomplish. We want them to be goal-oriented. That's what God wants for them to be achieving. But what we're seeing is that oftentimes that's coming at the expense of their mental, spiritual, and physical health. Let me share with you some statistics that we did in preparing for today's show. In an analysis of over 246 students that included 246 studies that included, listen to this, 41,000 college students, researchers found that all three forms of perfectionism, that's self-perfectionism, which is basically the expectations you have on yourself and trying to be as perfect as you can be, which is oftentimes, expectations that you really just are unable to meet. And then there's projecting unrealistic high standards on other people. That's another way of perfectionism, where we kind of expect people to do things that really they don't have the capacity to do. And then the final area of perfectionism that we're seeing that they interviewed on these 41,000 students is not only the self-perfectionism, but projected perfectionism on them, but also the third area was the perfectionism that we feel is being placed on us. And that one area, they found a tremendous increase of 33% increase in the projected increase on their ability to be achievers in an unhealthy way that's impacting them. And in fact, one of the studies shows that this prescribed perfectionism, this perfection that's being placed upon them, is leading to depression, anxiety, and sadly, suicidal ideation. So how do we deal with a culture, this achievement culture, wanting our children to be goal-oriented and strive to be their very best, but also recognizing that how do we deal with it in a culture that sometimes could be taking that and hurting them emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And so we thought we'd spend a show simply talking about that. So Roxanne, let's just talk a little bit about what we're seeing right now. For adolescents who feel pressure, who are struggling, I mean, what are some of the things that we're seeing now that are in this achievement culture that may have not been around, years and years ago?
Well, yeah, and we just actually got a comment already. And I think that, just the fact that comments are coming in already on this topic to me is just so, and it just epitomizes, where people are, that this is a huge burden and huge struggle. And the comment reads that this is a huge issue when it comes to choosing a college. There's so much pressure to get into a quote unquote great school that it is often completely overtaking, academic, financial, social, and spiritual, fits for kids. And we're sort of losing sight of this, right? And I would say that although the desire to succeed has sort of historically been a source of positive motivation for people, in today's day and age, the unrealistic ideal that is now modeled for our youth is creating a level of pressure that is detrimental, not only to their, I would argue, mental health and well-being, but their spiritual health and well-being, not to mention their physical. And so I would argue that, what's happening at the intersection of kids and achievement right now is not working for our kids. And both kids and parents, are really impacted by it. Right. Currently we hear that parents are now being coined and judged for stepping in to help their kids, and they're now touted as helicopter parents. But truthfully, helicopter parenting was not born out of a sudden desire to hover, right? Parents didn't just suddenly wake up and go, I really want to hover over my kids and sort of let go of my own life and sort of hover on theirs. It was born sort of out of this disparity between an idealized version of success and then realistic acknowledgments of what their adolescents' capabilities, capacities, and developmental resources really are. So there's this huge gap between what's expected and what we know they're capable of, right? And so parents have stepped in to sort of help close that gap for kids, to decrease the demand that has been now normalized and modeled for kids. And so if you're a parent right now, you may feel confused and discouraged when you look at this bar that is set for kids. They're being encouraged to really bite off more than they can chew. I mean, that's the across the board. They're being encouraged to bite off more than they can chew. And even the well-intended parent who tries to tell their kid, and I hear this all the time, we tell our kids, it doesn't matter if you get a poor test grade. It's not the end of the world. It's not making a difference to the stress levels of their kids because they are still internalizing from their community and culture that they're being brought up in the statistics that are real.
Well, I think too, Roxanne, I think that's such an important point that you just made because, in the past, I think for so many people, the pressure that to succeed was oftentimes, yes, part of that was within them. They wanted to succeed, but also there was this pressure. I know for me growing up, it was always like, the expectations that my parents had on them. But when looking back in these different areas that are these pressures that we're seeing about that was done, these three forms of perfectionism, that not only is it what we desire in our own motivation, our own desire to be great and godly great, I would say, but also the pressure that we're seeing being placed on us, and then the expectations that we have on them. And so we're almost setting ourselves up for, and I think at no other time do I see this as a parent, at least in my years as a priest and working with youth as well, do I ever see it setting our children up for failure, because if they don't meet that level of achievement that's being placed on them, not only by themselves, but more importantly, this 33% increase that they feel being placed from society on them, if they don't meet that, then their identity, which is so much closely associated with their achievement, becomes is broken.
Absolutely. And so this is really the struggle, that so much of a child's identity has now been almost forced into, one slice of their pie, what used to be one slice. I mean, I don't really remember, and maybe, you remember more, but I mean, yeah, there was a little bit of, hey, do a good job when you're young, but I don't really recall my parents being very heavily involved in my education, and I don't really recall that they needed to be. It was just sort of there. It was a slice of my pie, and I think I was worried about, other things. And I'm sure the same for you.
Absolutely.
But now what's been forced is that the other 7/8 of a kid's pie is sort of like pushed into the background, and because so much has changed over the last, I would argue, 3 to 4 decades.
And I think too, what's ended up happening is that, because if we're talking about this in the terms of a slice of a pie, if all of these things are being occupied with different things that they're being asked to do and to perform at, and that ultimately becomes, sadly, sometimes the way the educational system is being placed on them, then the sad part is that there's no time for God. That God becomes another piece of the pizza, as opposed to the one leading the pizza or leading the slices of our life. He becomes another to-do task as opposed to something that we want to do. And so I think that what we're seeing, and I think and more important, I think the studies are reflecting this, when we're seeing this increase of depression, anxiety, really unhealthy thinking, so again, we don't want to, we do not at all want to stop. I mean, I know with our own children, we definitely are we have expectations on them. But we try to keep ourselves, within reason, because we also recognize that, God has expectations on us to raise our children as godly children. But we also have to be very careful that the pressure that we're putting on, that we know are on them, may not also be what may be in addition to what they're already putting on themselves based upon these studies.
Absolutely. And I think we can't really undersell, what has changed over the last, several decades. And there is a growing emphasis on competition and individualism, right? We are steadily losing the mentality of the collective good. And our kids know this. I talk about this all the time, the collective good, that people have lost a sense of what's good for me, what's good for you, what's good for us all. It's really about individual promotion and achievement and personal acknowledgement at the cost of whoever you have to tear down to achieve that. We also know that applications to colleges have dramatically risen and admission rates have dropped, right? So some schools now have admission rates of 4 and 5%. Okay. And they're getting maybe 60 to 70,000 applications.
Right.
So this is just one school. So kids are seeing the statistics that in order to excel, they need to be excellent across multiple dimensions if they're going to stand out in that gigantic applicant pool that they're up against. And so, and the reality is they are judged by the numbers. They are judged by their performance. As much as we want to say, hey, be curious in your classes, really learn and follow the subjects you're interested in, read up more on a subject you're interested in. The, what's coming for them in the next chapter of their life may not allow for the kids who did that. So we have this sort of flip-flopped educational system that isn't working very well. And I would argue that even extracurriculars have become a source of resume building rather than the relief that was supposed to be built into an already stressful, environment. Our extracurriculars were supposed to be where we derived renewal. And now people are competing with each other outside the classroom, even in service work. I can remember in school, feeling this sort of tremendous level of meaning when I think at age 10 or 5th or 6th grade, I can't remember what it was. For some reason, I wanted to do a homeless drive. And we laugh about this, I know, because there's this little news thing about it. And I just was so, taken aback by the opportunity to serve this population that I didn't know much about. And it felt so good to go into there and, bring all this stuff that I collected from school and hand it out myself. And I was so changed by that experience. And never in a million years did I think this is something that I'll put on my resume, because it wasn't even in my mind that I would need that on a resume, okay, to get into school. Now, these are projects that kids are having to sort of invent to design their resume. So again, even our service work, our hobbies, our sports have all become, quite competitively driven.
Do you think, Roxanne, in your experience as a psychologist, that we're just, back in the day when we were going to high school, it was all about our exams, the SAT or the ACT, whichever exam that you chose to do, and then your GPA. There was some talk about, being well-rounded, but it was very limited. So it became just that core issues or that to-do list of things that you needed to do well at in order to get into college. Now they've kind of expanded that quote-unquote to-do list. I guess the question is do we feel like we're just creating students that are just doing the to-do list simply to get into college, or as opposed to really creating a well-rounded person that is able to think outside of just simply that to-do list and being more well-rounded with the world that we live in?
I would argue, in many ways, no. Unfortunately, you're being asked to design a marketing package of yourself that can be sold to a university that says, hey, I've done all these things and look what I may be able to do for your community. And so it's this sort of very odd, I've never seen anything quite like what kids are being asked to sort of do today. And we've really learned a lot about it with our kid our son being a senior, that these are just never things that kids could be curious about and just sort of follow passions. And this is something, you talk about in elementary school, but in later years, the educational system is not set up to really help kids thrive in that capacity. And,
I think one of the things that we want to be very clear with our listeners and viewers this evening is that this is something that is grabbing the attention of the American Psychological Association. This is grabbing the attention of many of those who are working with adolescents about this sudden increase of what we're seeing in pressure from within themselves, but also pressure that's being placed on them to be achievers, to create an achievement culture in an unhealthy way. We get the healthy part. That's all of what we talked about earlier. But recognizing that in an unhealthy way where their identity becomes solely about what they have accomplished as opposed to who God has made them to be. And so if you are an adolescent, or if you're a parent that has a question or just a comment, we'd love to hear from you. We're parents in this as well, and we'd love to hear from your comments, your questions. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346, or feel free to leave a comment on Ancient Faith's YouTube page or on the Louhs Facebook page. I do want to share with you, Roxanne, this was just a comment that came a little bit earlier. I think that this is just goes to what we were saying, but Orthodox Christian college counseling, this is a huge issue when it comes to choosing a college. Pressure to get into a good school completely overtakes what is the best academic, financial, social, and spiritual fit for the student. So I love that, because I think for many of us, it's becoming so much about getting into the college that we feel like we deserve to be going into, as opposed to really developing that well-rounded student. And I think, one of the things I love about the church, and the church is not silent about this, Roxanne. The church speaks a great deal about it. I love what St. John Chrysostom says. He says, we are so concerned with our children's schooling. If only we were equally zealous in bringing them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. In other words, being as well-rounded as we can in our desire to follow God's will and following Christ. And I think, we as parents, I think we are guilty of this too, Roxanne. I think it's so easy to get caught up in this achievement culture, even as parents. So not only are the children doing that, but we as parents. And let's talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Parents, for any of any of you have read the book Never Enough, Jennifer Wallace, collected quite a bit of data from, I think it was around 6,000, parents who sort of answered this question she had about why are we seeing so much angst? Because she too had kids. Why are we seeing so much angst in all of our kids? She was seeing the same thing. She found that 73% of parents believed that getting into a good college or selective college was going to be a key ingredient in their children's later success. 73% of parents, okay?
Jeez.
83% felt that their children's success is a direct reflection of their parenting. And at the same time, these same parents, 87%, wished that their childhood would be less stressful for their kids than what it actually is. 87% of parents are wishing that their kids were not dealing with as much stress as they were, but they are living in this culture, where this is so valued, so heavily valued, that it's hard to, again, be that salmon swimming upstream who says, we don't care, what's happening. We're going to do our own thing here.
Well, and I think, as we've been mentioning, I mean, this is so different than in many ways, than what we had growing up. And there were still, obviously, there were expectations. Every parent has some level of expectations upon their children, but the amount of expectations that are placed on them now, and then recognizing that not only are their identity, but the parent's identity, their parenting comes into question, their ability to, their success of how well they raise them is being tied to how well they achieve, and oftentimes what kind of college they get into. And I think we've done shows on just the competition of parenting that we see already in the world, and how sometimes just the unhealthy competition that takes place. But I'd love for you to talk a little bit, Roxanne, about just, what as parents, why have we allowed ourselves to become so caught up into that achievement culture ourselves, and basing our identity or our parenting on how well our children are on their success?
Yeah, I think, there's this, along with sort of things having changed over the decades, for our kids, and sort of seeing that, the struggle that they are having. And there's this, incredible empathy that I think parents have for their kids, wanting to sort of, help support them, I think is one of them. You see your kid working so hard, you want to support whatever it is that they're doing. Before this might have been, taking them to Little League, and now it's, helping them, market themselves. And I think you sort of pair that with the sort of worsening economic climate. We're seeing an increased cost of living. It's more difficult to get a job. More people have, a bachelor's degree. It doesn't help you stand out as much anymore, right? And so, to live, for your children to live the same or better life than what you had, which is what most parents want, the pressure to succeed and achieve and excel remains this sort of key player in guaranteeing that their child is going to have this sort of better life. The parents are sort of hoping for. So I think it's this sort of general combination of this, the empathy toward the struggle and seeing what they're up against. And again, just wanting to close that gap, for their kids.
I love that. I think hopefully this has been very beneficial. I know that in our preparation for this show, it was so beneficial for us to do the research, to gather the data, and to just see for ourselves just how much that's not only impacting the people that are in our lives, obviously our own children, but also those that hopefully parenting in general. Again, we invite you, if you have a question or comment for us, feel free to call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346, or leave a comment on Ancient Faith's YouTube page or on the Louhs Facebook page. Roxanne, I think it's, one of the things I as a parent, I always think to myself, I want the best for George and Gabriella, obviously, and I know you do as well. I think for a lot of us, we want to leave our children better off than what we are. And I think in an unhealthy way, if we're not careful, we can tie that solely to financial wealth, to status, titles, and how unhealthy that is, because that was never what Christ had intended for us. That yes, he wanted us, as we've been talking about, wanted us to be goal-oriented. But for some of us, we're kind of buying in, even subconsciously, that we want them to be okay in the ways of this world, as opposed to really feeding their soul.
So this is affecting our spiritual lives.
We see, a decline in young adults coming to church. We see a decline. This is across the board in most Christian churches around the world. I think this is something that there's something to be said about what's going on now with this achievement culture as well.
So, obviously it's affecting spiritual lives, for kids, as you're echoing so clearly. We do sort of start to lose sight of, what is the true purpose of why we've been given gifts and why we were meant to use them, and how we were meant to excel, and what is the means to the end of excelling, right? And achieving. And I think that focus has been lost and replaced with status seeking, and a fear and lots of insecurity and self-doubt, and unhealthy levels of perfectionism. This is what's going up across the board. The concern over mistakes, lots of, self-doubt, performance anxiety, rigid expectations that breed depression and disappointment when things aren't met. And we are seeing, in these competitive cultures, kids are 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorder. And so, the stress is very real, and I see all the talk about, cell phone usage. And, for the life of me, I just want to scream, the reason they're using the cell phone so much is they're trying to escape the stress. And I would argue that the cell phone is not necessarily helping that, and sometimes make it worse, and further dysregulate. But the reason it's being reached for so much is there's not a lot of energy to do much of anything else. And rest and renewal to most teenagers in this day and age looks like grabbing the phone and trying to zone out, because they're looking for escape because of so much chronic dysregulation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think just hearing those mental health statistics about how we're seeing our children, just seeing the increasing levels of depression, just pressure in general, has to be so startling. So here we are, as the Bible talks about, that we're trying to have our children gain the world, but we're losing their soul. We're losing them in the process. And I think it's so important as Christians to also remember, and is that, every time the enemy wants to attack humanity, oftentimes he attacks the most vulnerable, which is our children. We see that happening in the story of Moses in the Old Testament, where Pharaoh attacks the children, kills the children. And then we see that in the New Testament, where in Christ in the Nativity, where they're killing the holy innocents, the children. And I think, obviously we're not talking about them killing, but we're also killing what God's intent for them. And so I think it's so important that we really spend some time in talking about how this is impacting our youth spiritually. And so we're going to talk about that right after the break. But what we'd love to, again, encourage you, if you're a parent, or just or an adolescent that's just struggling with the pressure that you're feeling, and you want to talk about it, you can totally be anonymous. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346, or email us a question at ask@ancientfaith.com. Or you can leave a comment on Ancient Faith's YouTube or the Louhs Facebook page. We'll be right back to continue this conversation.
Roxanne will be back in a moment. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. They would love to hear from you.
Are you struggling in your walk with Christ? Do you want to rediscover your reason for living, the person you were created to be? Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan gives you the keys to unlock areas of your life that hold you back from fully experiencing the renewal and transformation God has in mind for you. Co-authored by a priest and a psychologist, Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, Renewing You combines principles of spiritual growth with psychological tools to help you become your best self, fully connected with God's purpose for you. To purchase this book, please go to store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Live with the Louhs and Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne. Do you have a question for the Louhs? Call in now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Here once again is Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to Live with the Louhs. So grateful that you're joining us this evening. We are on this topic of the achievement culture and our youth, this impact that has been having on our youth. And just as I encourage you all, we did during the break, is definitely call us if you have a question or a comment. I know we're getting tons of comments from parents that are just really benefiting from this show. But if you've got a question that you would love to share with us, or if you have a concern that maybe that we're not talking about on the show, or that a concern that you have about what we're seeing in our world, feel free to let us know. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. And feel free to leave a comment on Ancient Faith's YouTube page and on the Louhs Facebook page. Roxanne, right before the break, we were talking about how is this impacting our youth spiritually? And I think that, I'll start this out, but I'd love to hear your comments as well, just in your own experience as a psychologist. But
Sure. Well, we had someone who just wrote in, and I think they epitomized this beautifully. And the writer says, "Thank you for helping to bring this to light. We must be in tune with our children, focus on preserving and building their spirit. The pressures are so strong, and we have seen how they have created anger, pain, and anxiety as early as 4th grade. We've now chosen to homeschool, and the pressures are being relieved with a renewed focus on the spirit while filtering in other academic areas. And what's the use of memorizing math if a child is unhappy and their spirit is crushed under the pressures?" And this is what I'm saying, the crushed under the pressures, right? The physical exhaustion, the poor energy, not being able to renew, and really this sort of state of generalized agitation, which the spirit was never meant to sort of, have this chronic source of agitation, unless the Holy Spirit's trying to get our attention and say, hey, shift gears. But it's a lingering sort of internal angst and intensity that makes it hard to relax, and also makes it hard to accept the renewal that can come from relationship, right? So most people who are stressed find that they are unable to really derive joy from connection, because it's sort of like they push it away. And, there's sort of a lack of motivation to do anything. And I think that includes, taking care of our spiritual health, taking time to really open up in prayer, in terms of opening up to the vulnerability that's on our heart, because sometimes the vulnerability that's on our heart is so scary to acknowledge, that people are pushing away the spiritual life, because the spiritual life requires this sort of transparency within ourselves that oftentimes we're too afraid to do. And, the racing thoughts, the cyclical worry,
or even just, the inability to truly focus in prayer, because your mind is always going everywhere. The inability to, even when you're at a church, that you're thinking about tasks that you need to do. And obviously as parents, I think that, people in the pews, our minds tend to wander. That's going to happen. But there is very little break for our youth that we're seeing, especially with these expectations that they put on themselves, but also, as we've been talking about, this expectation that's being placed upon them that they feel, and not having that opportunity to just simply be children and be youth, whether they're adolescents or whether they're teenagers. This kind of goes to a point. This is from I would imagine a young person. Says, how do I see my full potential in school without taking it too far and doing too much that I can actually handle?
And we are going to get to that actually in the next chapter of this show. It's going to be all about, what can we do? And how much is too much, and how to know that. But I think just to sort of early answer that, we do sort of have to monitor our own, signs that we are doing too much. When you start to feel that lack of motivation, basic responsibilities and self-care are just out the window. We aren't sleeping. We aren't praying. We aren't, taking time to be in church and to join in community, doing service work for the sake of service work, to just experience meaning. Our vices start to get worse, or we start to have a negative perspective and becoming very hypercritical of ourselves and other people. And we have this sort of decreased empathy. We don't want to give. We don't feel we can give. And we're less able to see needs around us. We have an emotional numbness. These are all sort of signs that our striving has kind of become unhealthy. And the drive to succeed is sort of overwhelming our resources, and we have to draw back, seek our purpose, seek our meaning, and come back to the true gifts, embracing our true gifts and trying to bring those into fruition, instead of trying to live up to a bar that is set for us that is about success or status.
And I think, Roxanne, you highlighted this beautifully, and I just want to kind of really encourage our listeners to hear this, that when our youth are experiencing that level of pressure, something's got to give. And yes, an area of that is going to be, their spiritual life. But even going one step further, the cascading effect of this is that when our children are spiritually, emotionally, and I would argue physically tired, I know that we see it sometimes in our own son, George, staying up very late doing academic work. And, every student is different. Some students learn quickly and some, require more time. And I know that was the way I was. I was not an easy student. Things didn't come easy for me. I had to spend a great deal of time rereading. But when you're experiencing that spiritually, physically, and mentally fatigue, what ends up happening is that three things happen, and we talk about this a lot on the show, is that we will sin more, our emotions will be all over the place. That's number two. And then the third area is that we won't be close to God, or we won't hear God. And so you're seeing this, if you just look at everything that is wrong that we're seeing that's being placed on our children, the temptations of their own identity, who they are as a people. We see the lustful parts that the society and through media and through other areas are trying to tell our children what is a normal behavior to have between them and another person intimately, or actually sexually, to be quite honest with you. And then you see the areas of where we're seeing a massive decline in church attendance and just church connectivity. That's one of the fastest growing areas in America, at least specifically, are what we call the nuns. So those are NONES. Those are the areas where the children, where adolescents, most of that's adolescents, are finding aren't associating with any religion at all. Either they're atheists, they're agnostic, they're unhappy with the church, they're unhappy with Christianity, or unhappy with religion in general. So this is the cascading effect of this that we have to be aware of. And so as parents, we have to fight for our youth. We have to fight for our children. And the scriptures talk about that in the book of Nehemiah and other areas that talk about our desire to fight for them. But the challenge that you and I have to face is that as we're identifying this problem of, it will impact their relationship with Christ and with God. And we've got to be aware that sometimes it's not, it's, how can I put it? It's impacting their ability to want to be connected. And so when the only source that actually can bring comfort, they're spending less time with. So I know there's a question, Roxanne, that came in. I thought that would be a great question. It says, my child was admitted early to medical school. She always wanted to be a physician. After 2 years of medical school, she fell in love with an Orthodox Christian and wanted to devote her life to her husband and raising her children, a life that she felt she could not devote herself to while still in school. It was devastating for us as parents, but she's happy. Can you please say something to make this easier to digest?
And this is, this is so hard, right? This is where, your child chooses something that makes them happy, but the culture would say, hey, you got into medical school, which most people would say is the epitome of the top. You made it to the top, and you chose to walk away for something that people would say, well, you can have that too. Mm-hmm. But I will say, in a study that was conducted, I think it was last year, researchers were finding that, in the population of females who had become very high achieving females, so these were CEOs, presidents of banks, head physicians in hospitals, they were sort of seeing this sort of general malaise, toward their older years, in their 50s and 60s. And they began to do some research to sort of tease out, what was happening. Mm-hmm. And the most common thread that was found when asked of these women, if you knew now what you knew then, would you still choose the same career? And over 90% said no. Mm. And when asked why, they said because the cost was too great to my relationship, to my relational world, that they missed large bouts of their children's lives, that the connectivity in their relationships, if they still were in one, was poor, and to them, there was such a cost that had they known then what they knew now, they wouldn't have chosen the same path, even though they were equipped. So, even though your daughter is equipped, to be a physician, perhaps, she's more fulfilled by being a physician to a soul, to connection and to caring for families. And I think in many ways, we've sort of lost the beauty that exists in a woman or a man, for that matter, choosing that over something that society would deem as status. We've deemed it wrong, but is it wrong? We're designed for a multitude of things. And I think it's beautiful when someone can choose to say, this is where my soul feels at peace. And those are signs often that I feel are God's design, and who knows how, she may be a physician later in doing all sorts of,
Absolutely.
we don't know without the end of that story, but something to think about.
Yeah, and I think it goes to what we were mentioning earlier as well, that, we have to be very careful that we want our children to do the very best, to be goal-oriented, to strive to be their very best, but also to recognize that God loves our children more than we do, and that we have to, in many ways, to simply surrender that and what their desires are to where they feel God is leading them. And if that's in parenting, obviously, I think it's one of the best decisions that they could make. But I just think that we have to be very careful not to try to associate, as we mentioned earlier, our identity with where they are, or their identity, what they've done. You obviously have done an amazing job raising her, because she's someone that has found someone in the church. She's someone that is growing, obviously, in her faith. That's something that was important for her. So I think it's an extraordinary gift that you have bestowed within her to do that, and I think it's something that should be honored as well. So Roxanne, I know we've been talking earlier about all the areas of just kind of laying the landscape of why we're seeing this problem in this with our youth, this achievement culture that's being placed on our youth. But let's try to, as we do with every show, let's try to be very practical with them. And I know over the last couple of days in preparation for the show, we really spent some time doing a great deal of research on some practical things that we can all do as parents. So let's go over those. Let's talk about the very first one, like teaching our youth how to respond to their idealized versions of things they see in others.
Yeah, so this is all about envy, right? The thing we look at someone else and go, wow, how did they get there?
Mm-hmm.
I want that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to respond to that envy is a very real, feeling that our kids, and especially in adolescents, have an awareness of. This is a time period when their sense of self is being developed, and social comparison and group membership is a huge part of that. Mm-hmm. It's a healthy part of that, right? There's looking to sort of say, where do I fit into this group? And who am I in relation to others? And so I think we really have to not try to tell our kids, hey, don't be envious. Mm-hmm. What we want to do is teach them how to respond to the feeling when it lands. Mm-hmm. And so, that requires really thinking about responding to that, not in a way that tears themselves down, right? And I think that's common, right? They have this, what's wrong with me? How come I'm not good enough? And there's this sort of self-disparaging that occurs. That's not the right answer. Mm-hmm. And then there's the wanting to tear down others to get what they have, right?
Right.
Obviously not the right answer. Genuinely what we really want to do is kind of come back to asking ourselves, what am I admiring and mm-hmm. why? And the curiosity that can kind of take place in that, why is it that person has something that I admire? What is it about that I truly mm-hmm. admire? And is chasing that really going to help materialize my strengths? God's design for my life? Is that what I'm designed for? Does it reflect my values? The things that are important, to me, or that I've always found important. Then maybe if the answer is yes, to many of those things, well, what did they do to get there? And really beginning to study, is that possible for me? And really looking at this is where mentors kind of come into place. You look at someone who's several steps ahead of where you want to be, and you really start to study, what steps did you take next, rather than going from A to Z and self-disparaging because you're not there. What's step B? What did that look like for you? What were you doing when you were where I'm at? And most importantly, does that feel like a right fit for me in terms of, God's design for me? Does it feel like like something I could say yes to easily. God's purpose for our life and his meaning, and when he uses our gifts, are usually things that we can kind of say yes to easily. They're not things we're sort of like swimming upstream the entire time for, right? And so I think that, when we notice our kids are sort of struggling with the envy, we're really teaching them not to sort of shove it away, but to study it, and to decide like where to go from there because of it.
I think that's so powerful, because I think for a lot of us, we get drained in the envy part, but not looking at how do I respond to that? How do I look at that and say, okay, let me try to be the best version of Christ in me, and recognizing that you may not have certain gifts. I mean, I know that, for all of us, there's things that, we may have thought that we had on our heart that we could do. And ultimately in time, we realize that we just don't have we may not have those gifts, but it is to look at that person and to enjoy the striving part. I think it's something that's a core teachings in our Christian way of life, that is to constantly strive to go to the next step, to get to the next level, wherever that level takes us. It may not be to where that other person is, but at least we're constantly striving and not getting caught into what the enemy loves for us to do, is to simply get mired down in the jealousy part, the envy part, as opposed to saying, okay, that's an unhealthy competition. Let me look for a healthy competition to move forward with. So, number one was teaching our youth how to respond to idealized versions of things that we see in other people, like to find ways to be inspired by what other people are doing in their gifts. But here's number two, Roxanne, I think this is also to our parents, is remember, praise can often breed pressure. Let's talk about that as well.
Yeah, and it's so natural, to praise our kids. They come home and say, oh, I got an A on this. And what do we say? Great job. We're so proud of you. And, ultimately what that does is sort of create a pressure, right? Like, I got to keep doing the great job, right? When someone does great in sports, or they're being told, you're really great at this, you're going to take the team home. It's like that kid walks out and feels a level of pressure to come up to that level that is expected of him. That goes back to the socially prescribed perfectionism that I feel like I have to live up to this sort of expectation that's put on us. And listen, this is so natural to sort of respond like that, but truly, we really want our praise to be, toward gifts that our kids actually have control over. I don't believe kids actually have control over getting an A. They have control over being prepared. They have control over being organized enough to be prepared. They have control over, trying to persevere and study something even when they don't, love it. They have, control over, trying to understand the material, but that's really it. How it results is not in their control. And so I think that we have to be careful that what we're praising are things that they do have that control over. And ultimately, we want them to be loved and known for just who they are, not by the bar that they can consistently reach.
That will never be attained. Because there's always going to be another step to go.
Right. I mean, so even praise, such as, I really love how kind and inclusive you are. Like when you were at that event, I just loved how you made everybody feel like a part of, your group, and I love how deeply you pray when I walk into your room and I see you there. I love how you stuck with that subject, even though it was really tough, and you tried, no matter how it turned out. I like that you gave it your best shot. And so I think that, ideally we are wanting to sort of, cultivate, virtues and values in kids that we want to see them cultivate, because kids do tend to identify with the things they've been noticed for repeatedly. So the things that have been said over them, that's what they learn to identify themselves with. And listen, if your kid does come home with great grades or whatever, you shouldn't invalidate that. I mean, right. You just don't want your praise to be so imbalanced toward the performance that's really all that they're talking about, right? So you may even want to praise them for going to bed early, enough to get their brain have ample rest. So that they're learning that other things matter rather than just the result of sort of how it turned out.
So maybe even focusing just more on the internal as opposed to the external.
Yeah, and remember the values in action survey we've talked about before. It's called viacharacter.org, and it stands for Values in Action. But that's really a survey that your child can take, you can take as an adult, that reveals your signature strengths. Your God-given design, the things that you are going to, you can't help but practice because they're just wired into your very being. And we really want kids to be known for those things. Because they're always going to be something that they're moved toward. And ultimately, it's going to be something that they use to overcome obstacles. And also, it's going to be used to sort of design their path of purpose. So if you haven't taken that survey, that's one for your whole family, quite honestly, to jump in. And it'll give you sources of praise for your kids.
Well, we talked about this next one, Roxanne, a little bit earlier, but I think we can spend a little bit more time on it. That's just the difference between healthy and unhealthy striving.
Yeah, and all the general stress signals that we talked about before are important here, but really that unhealthy striving is sort of like, the kid who can't take a break, who if they don't do well, they berate themselves. There's this sort of whole 24-hour cycle of, intrusive thoughts around, how horrible it was and the prediction of that for what that means in my life. So it becomes this sort of domino effect of everything's now falling because of this. And doing well becomes more important than caring for themselves. So that's an important one too, an unhealthy striving that, they're not eating, they're not sleeping, their stomach is all messed up and, they're still striving. And also I would say, when you see unhealthy coping that is present. So these are kids who don't know how to cope or who never learned how to cope with stress are the ones who end up, drinking to black out in college because they don't know or never learned how to rest and recover or to read their body's signs that too much is too much and they don't know when enough is enough. And so I think, healthy striving are people who know how to rest and recover. They have deliberate rest. And, parents need to be the guardrails for that and to kind of create the supportive infrastructure on friendships, peer socialization, all the things that kids need outside of the studying. Right.
Well, and I think that's, leads us to our next point, which is whatever we do, we don't want to add more pressure onto our children. So let's talk a little bit about that as well.
Well, I think sometimes, as parents, we tell them what they need to be doing instead of observing how they're actually doing. We tell them about our needs rather than helping them acknowledge their own and finding ways to help them meet those needs. And I think so as parents, we want to kind of do a better job of stepping into their world. And I think decades ago, this was less necessary. You didn't have to step into kids' worlds that much, but now we really do. And so I think that we unintentionally as parents can create more pressure in a state where they're already beyond capacity. And we get this sort of agitated response in those situations.
Okay, so I love this one, and I think it's so important. I love this because I know it's important to me, and I know it is important to you as well, and that's relationships matter. Let's talk about how, just connecting not only with our children, but also them connecting with the right relationships and how that helps or can hurt, if they're in an unhealthy way, if they're around people that also perpetuate that unhealthy achievement culture.
Yeah, so our youth really need to be socializing. They need relationships. They need connection. They need to be making time for those relationships. Relationships where they can be themselves, where they can let go of striving in lieu of just being present and being heard and being valued and understood. And, keep in mind as adults, we need that too. According to research, studies show that our kids' resilience is coming from our resilience, right? And our resilience as adults comes from having deep and fulfilling relationships ourselves with people who help us feel heard, known, and understood. So there's this sort of domino effect of, the reminder of God's design of He designed us for connection. And so we want to encourage our kids to have relationships with other peers who allow them to feel intimately known, supported, heard through their stress and vulnerability, people who make it okay for them to be themselves. And in achievement culture, those relationships are necessary, but often we don't have the time. And when we do have the time, we're so tired that we don't feel like it. And so I would say, look for families that you can be friends with as families who are good examples of, a good work-life balance, but people who have found their meaning through their work.
Right.
People who are using their work as a source, not of status, but of meaning, and they're affecting their communities. And that family can sort of act as a buffer for what your kids are seeing in the communities they have at school.
We've only got a few minutes left, Roxanne. I want to make sure we get these last points, but intentional rest matters. And I know that we see that even with our own children. Let's talk a little bit about how important it is for our children to get the rest that they need.
Well, the brain learns best and makes connections best when it's at rest. And when we have restful sleep. In fact, the restorative, stages of the sleep cycle happen later into the night and into the morning. And so, I wish we could sort of systemically change how early schools start. But kids need rest, and they need intentional breaks throughout the day. And so if you see your kids, going long bouts of time studying, encourage them every hour to take about 15 minutes, just to pause and to sit back and to do nothing and to close their eyes. That's when they're going to feel their stress signals. That's when they're going to know that too much is too much. And it's when their brain has just a bit of time to wonder and possibly make connections about what they're even learning. So ask them the question of how do they rest and renew best? And they should be able to answer that. If they can't, or if they say my cell phone, it may be worth a bigger conversation.
All right, last two, and that is know your definition of success.
Well, and so I think for this, again, kids live so much in your own unconscious as a parent, but I think as parents, we have to know, how do we define success? Like, pay attention to the first thing your kid usually shares with you, and then what you tend to ask them about. Because those two questions tend to reflect your values, what your kids think are your values and what you project as your values. And so, think about what you think about the whole purpose of striving is even for, are we achieving for ourselves, for our worth, for the bar, for the status, or are we sort of seeing achievement as a means to an end, a greater end, which is a life of purpose that's built around our gifts. This, I think, and I'm sure you feel the same way, that that's what achievement was designed for, to sort of help us materialize what we were designed for. And so, help them see everything that really matters, right? Cultivate that identity of, your life should have meaningful work, healthy hobbies, service work that makes an impact, that leaves you feeling convicted, healthy friendships that, again, help you be yourself. Physical health, spiritual health, these are all the things. And so the definition of success as parents, we really want to model encapsulates really all of those things. And so the achievement at school is really just one slice.
I love what you're sharing, Roxanne, because I think that, as we're closing out the show, we've kind of shared with our listeners today about 8 different topics, and I really want to highlight them just once again. Is number 1, teach our youth how to respond to an idealized versions of things they see in others. And that's just kind of taking what we see in them and others and asking that, what can we learn? How can we take what they are and try to learn and inspire ourselves to be better? The second one we talked about was, remember, praise can often breed pressure, and just remembering what we're praising our children can also lead to additional pressure and unhealthy expectations in them. Know the difference is number 3. Know the difference between healthy and unhealthy striving. And then whatever we do, don't add more pressure onto our children. Remind them that relationships matter for them as well as for us as parents. So make sure that we're around other parents that have the same vision that we do as parents, but also to try to find friends that our children gravitate to that also can allow them to be themselves. Intentional rest matters is the next one, making sure that we're finding what really helps our children to relax and to rest. Know our definition of success, because oftentimes that'll come down onto them. And then the final thing is help your children find meaning and know that they matter. And I think, Roxanne, that's something that we have to constantly remind ourselves, that our children are God's gift to us, and how we raise them is our gift back to God. So our challenge for all of us, including us as a family, is to try our best to make sure that, yes, let's have them goal oriented, let's have them striving, but not at the expense of who they are and who God has called them to be. And so I hope that and pray that this show really has been inspiring for all of you. We've never done a show quite on this topic before, and so hopefully you'll find this beneficial. If you do us a favor, friends, and share it with your friends and your family. Next Tuesday, we have a brand new show on Live with the Louhs, and next Tuesday, we're going to be spending a great deal of time talking about, as we're in this holiday season, how do we make sure that we're making a difference? How God has created us to actually be hardwired to make a difference, and how we can do that not only just during the holiday season, but throughout the year. You don't want to miss that show next Tuesday. I want to thank Matushka Trudy for always producing tonight's show. Roxanne, I love her so much. She's just an amazing friend and an amazing worker for Ancient Faith Ministries. And again, as I mentioned at the top of the show, if you're looking for a great gift to give during this holiday season, definitely consider Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan that covers the 8 topics that we see the most as a priest and psychologist, as well as our newest book, 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, How Christ's Light Transcends Our Darkness. How do we deal with when we have our own bad days in our life? Both of these books, all the proceeds go to outreach ministries that we're really excited about. And so we encourage you to do so. My friends, God bless you all and stay strong in your walk of faith.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of their books Renewing You, a priest, a psychologist, and a plan, and 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, How Christ's Light Transcends Our Darkness, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.